Okay, so that first video was just a very brief introduction to me as your instructor and the class, but now we're going to dive into this more substantial topic. What is philosophy? So philosophy's literal translation is love of wisdom, but that doesn't really give us much about what it is. Unlike other disciplines, there isn't a very universally accepted definition of philosophy. So each professor of philosophy might give you a slightly different definition of what the discipline actually is. So you get like biology, which is the study of living organisms, or anthropology, the study of cultures. Philosophy just doesn't really have that specific meaning, at least. And then again, that's part of the philosophical discipline, is that everything that you say, all the conclusions that you draw, all the reasons that you have for a conclusion can be argued. Anything can be argued. There's this crazy argument in epistemology, which is a branch of philosophy that talks about how your hand doesn't exist, that you can't believe the conclusion that my hand exists. Someone's going to say, no, your hand does not exist. So that's how abstract and deep this argumentation goes, objections go. But that's a little tangent, basically saying that whatever definition that I provide of what philosophy is, there is going to be some philosopher who can argue it, because that's what philosophers do, we argue. But I would argue that the best definition of philosophy is the art of argumentation, or the study of argumentation. But study's a little bit, I'm not really happy with the way that study is, because it's more than just analyzing arguments. Philosophy is creating arguments, evaluating arguments, responding to or objecting to arguments. There's so many different things that you can do within philosophy, but they're all related to argumentation. So there are three main subdivisions in philosophy, and some other philosophers want to argue that there are 4 or 5. So the three main subdisciplines that I'm going to be discussing are metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. But some other philosophers want to say the 4th subdiscipline is logic. But here's my argument for why logic deserves its own overarching branch over all of the disciplines, and that is because you can't do any philosophy within any of the subdivisions without understanding and knowing some logic. If you want to argue something in the metaphysical realm, you need to use our logic to present, evaluate, discuss whatever argument that you're going to be presenting or objecting to. Same goes for axiology, same goes for metaphysics. So I treat logic more hand in hand with what philosophy is. Like, you can't do philosophy without understanding or knowing some logic. It's part of the overarching picture of what philosophy is, which is why we're going to be spending all next week talking about logic specifically. And they have an entire class of concerning logic. But like I just mentioned, there are 3 main subdisciplines: metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. Some people also want to include logic as a 4th one, and then some other people want to include the history of philosophy. History of philosophy is an interesting one, because some philosophers treat history of philosophy like a history discipline. So it's more just like presenting arguments throughout the history of philosophy and making comparisons between these types of arguments. But others are actually diving deeper into the history and are making arguments about the history of philosophy. So one big name in philosophy is David Hume, and he's tons and tons of works in philosophy. Some historians of philosophy, they just present Hume's view and they explain Hume's view, but other historians of philosophy argue about Hume's view. So they make certain theses, certain conclusions concerning his view, and then they use evidence and reason to defend those conclusions. Back to these main subdisciplines, the 3 that I want to be talking about. Metaphysics is about the nature of the world, like the nature of being. So what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to be a person? What's the difference between humans and other living organisms? What is the nature of the actual world, the earth, things like that. Epistemology is about the nature of knowledge. So what does it mean to know something? What does it mean to be justified in believing something? So it's all about knowledge specifically. And then axiology, and this can be broken up into two subdivisions of aesthetics on the one hand and ethics on the other. So when I say something like that painting is beautiful, that's a philosophical claim about a painting that lies in the subdiscipline of axiology, because I'm positing some value to that that painting. I'm saying it is beautiful. And so why am I saying it? What reasons do I have to make the claim that it's beautiful? What theory, what aesthetic theory am I appealing to make that claim? Why am I justified in making that claim over saying it's ugly or meaningless or pointless? But specific to our class is ethics. So when we say value in ethics, we mean why is something good versus bad? And what does it mean for something to be good versus bad? What does it mean for something to be morally right versus morally wrong? Another way to say this is also normative value. So normativity within philosophy is all about the moral values that we're going to be using to assess actions, beliefs, things of that nature. So I want to say that anything that you can argue about can be a philosophical subject, and anything that you can argue about can fit into one of these categories. So that's why I would say that logic is not a subdiscipline, because logic resides within each discipline. But let me give you some examples. And this is a great way to start thinking about philosophy, is when I make a grand claim, like anything that you can argue can be a philosophical subject, that's my conclusion. Now I need to give you some reasons for the conclusion, and some good reasons for certain conclusions can be examples. So this is a very abstract statement that I'm talking about. I want to give you some concrete, real world examples in order to help you understand why I'm making this claim versus some other claim. So let's look about, so I already talked about art being within the realm of axiology, value theory, but you can talk about like medicine, philosophy of science. So yeah, we can talk about like the COVID vaccine and the methods that people have been using to create these vaccines. Are they good methods? Are they bad methods? There are certain arguments in favor of each position. That those arguments, those questions reside in the philosophy of science. In the philosophy of science, since it's about the nature of the world, the vaccines are part of our world, it would fit into the metaphysics category. So it's about the nature of the world. We get more narrowed down. The nature of science, we get more narrowed down. The nature of vaccine manufacturing. That fits into the metaphysical area. But people also make normative claims about this. They say the vaccine is good or the vaccine is bad. So those normative claims, the placing value on the vaccine, fits into the axiology category. And again, there's arguments for why the vaccine is good. There's arguments for why the vaccine is bad. Some of these arguments are good. Some of these arguments are bad. And those all fall into axiology. But notice I just said that there are good and bad arguments about the nature of vaccine manufacturing. That's the philosophy of logic. So now we're doing philosophy about philosophy. So it's this meta logic. That might fit into its own separate category, or it can fit into the metaphysics category, reasoning about our reasoning processes. And again, philosophy is a very unique discipline, so this might be a little bit complicated and abstract for you, but as we go along, you'll get the hang of it and you'll understand how it differs from these other disciplines and how this meta thought about philosophy isn't as crazy as you might think. Like I said, if you can argue about any subject, then you can also argue about philosophy. The philosophy fits within the class set of any topic. Okay. So logic specifically is concerned about the principles of correct and incorrect reasoning. So like I just said, there are good reasoning, there's bad reasoning, good arguments, bad arguments. How do we determine whether an argument is good versus whether an argument is bad? And that's why I think logic is so important. That's why I think logic is just fundamentally, inherently philosophical. It doesn't fit into one of these disciplines. It is the discipline of philosophy. And I personally think that logic is one of the most important skills a human being can have. Like, so I work right on non-human animal cognition, and within philosophy, within my expertise, philosophers are always trying to find what makes human beings different from other animals. And a lot of philosophers want to appeal to logic, that we say human beings have the ability to reason about these abstract topics. And then we have the ability to use our reasoning to guide our actions. And they want to say that all other animals in the entire planet, they don't do that. And so that's why I think logic is so important. I think every single human being to exist should take some logic. We all inherently are logical creatures as human beings, with our ability to use language, our ability to abstract away from semantics, from semantics, and reason about pure syntax. With this reasoning, we have to be able to figure out what ways are correct ways to reason and what ways are incorrect ways. And another way to say that, what's a good argument and what's a bad argument? And there are clear-cut cases of bad arguments. And I think especially in today's times, with all this misinformation around on the web, on Facebook, on all these other social media platforms, the ability to identify a good argument versus a bad argument it's invaluable. And not only just for the inherent sake of being a good philosopher, of understanding truth and falsehoods, but also for pragmatic reasons. To guide your actions, you need to be able to identify what's a good argument, what's a good reason to do something versus what's a bad reason to maybe you shouldn't do that thing. And yeah, so I think a lot of the problems in the world, not only in the United States, but worldwide, could be solved if human beings actualize their dormant potential to be logical thinkers. You just take some logic throughout your life, because it will change the way you think. Much like learning a second language changes the way that you think about the world, learning some logic will change the way that you think, and it changes the kind of person that you are. So yeah, logic's intended to evaluate when evidence or reasons actually support a conclusion versus when evidence and reasons actually don't support a conclusion. People are constantly spouting conclusions about things all the time, like abortion is wrong and euthanasia is wrong, and you've done something morally wrong if you don't go to college, or if you just work at a fast food place. These are all conclusions. Now, do they actually have good evidence for those conclusions? And does the evidence that they present actually support that conclusion? Or is it supporting something else that they don't know about? Logic is a skill, just like I've been saying philosophy is, something that you have to practice. And I think, yeah, every human being can be a logical thinker, but they do need some guidance. They do need some practice. And that's why I think logic is so important, not only for philosophy, but just for being a human being. And to motivate this position a little bit more, like I was saying in, I think, a previous video, or maybe earlier in this video, if you're in law, if you're in medicine, and if you're in business or government or any discipline whatsoever, you need to do some logic. You need to present and endorse some arguments, some conclusions. And to be good at doing this, to actually convince people of things that you want to convince them of, you need some logic. So hopefully I've convinced you how important logic is. But again, I just presented an argument to you with a certain conclusion that logic is the best thing ever. So feel free to disagree with me. That's all philosophy is agreeing and disagreeing, evaluating, creating arguments. And yeah, I will talk to you soon.